The London Séance Society by Sarah Penner. For my big sister, Kelly. And for you, Mom. After all, you were the first to say, let's go to a seance. The 7 stages of ACNCE. Number 1. Ancient Devil's Incantation. The medium recites an incantation to protect seance participants from rogues and fiends. Number 2. Invocation. The medium issues a summons to all nearby spirits to enter the seance room. Number 3. Isolation. The medium rids the room of all spirits except the target spirit, the deceased person whom the seance participants intend to contact. Number 4. Invitation. The medium compels entrancement by the deceased spirit. Number 5. Entrancement. The medium is entranced by the deceased spirit. Number 6. Denouement. The medium ascertains the information desired. And number 7. Termination. The medium expels the deceased spirit from the room, ending the entrancement and concluding the seance. Chapter 1. Lena, Paris. Thursday, the 13th of February 1873. At an abandoned chateau on the wooded outskirts of Paris, a dark seance was about to take place. The clock read 32 minutes after midnight. Lena Wicks, spiritualist understudy, sat at an oval table draped in black linen. A gentleman and his wife, the other seance participants, sat at the table with her. Their faces were somber and their breathing uneasy. They were in what was once the parlor of the dilapidated chateau, which had not been inhabited for 100 years. Behind Lena, blood-colored paper peeled from the walls, clusters of mildew hiding underneath. If all went well tonight, the ghost they sought, that of a young woman, murdered here in this very place, would soon appear. Above them, something skittered. Mice, surely. Lena had seen the droppings when they walked in, the tiny black kernels scattered about the baseboards. But then the skitter turned to a scratching noise, and was that a thud she'd just heard? She fought off a chill, thinking that if ghosts did indeed exist, this derelict shadow would be the place to find them. She glanced quickly out the window into the darkness. Fat, wet snowflakes, rare for Paris, drifted down around the shadow. They'd set a few lanterns outside, and Lena's eyes fell on the metal gate at the front of the estate, wrapped in dead ivy vines and quivering in its brace. Beyond it stood dark, thick forest, the needly evergreens dusted with white. The seance participants, called sitters, had gathered at midnight. The parents of the victim, whom Lena had met several days prior to this event, arrived first. They were followed soon after by Lena and her teacher, the renowned medium who would lead tonight's affair, Vaudeline Dallaire. All of them were dressed in black, and the energy in the room was neither warm nor welcoming. As the parents waited in their seats, their movements were nervous and abrupt. The father knocked over a brass candlestick and apologized profusely. Lena, opening her notebook from across the table, couldn't blame him. They were all anxious, and Lena had wiped her damp palms on her gown a dozen times already. No one wanted to spend this agonizing hour under Vaudeline's guidance. The price of admission was terribly high, and that wasn't accounting for the francs she required up front. The spirit they meant to conjure tonight was not of the everyday sort. But nor were any of the ghosts Vaudeline invited to come forth. These were not old grandmothers in white nightgowns, lives lived long, stalking through corridors. These were not the casualties of war, valiant men who'd known what they were getting themselves into. No, these ghosts were victims of violence and gone too soon. They'd been murdered, every one of them. And worse, their killers had got away. This was where Vaudeline came in, and it was why people sought her out. People like the couple trembling across the table now. People like Lena. Vaudeline, age 30, was known throughout the world for her skill in conjuring the spirits of murder victims in order to ascertain the identities of their killers. An esteemed spiritualist, she had solved several of Europe's most baffling murder mysteries. Her name had made headlines dozens of times, especially after her departure from London early last year, the circumstances of which yet remained unclear. Even still, this hadn't dampened her loyal, worldwide following. She lived now in Paris, her city of birth. The Forgotten Shadow was an unusual place for a seance, but then much was strange about Vaudeline's methods, and she claimed spirits could only be conjured at the location where they'd died. 2 weeks earlier, on the 1st of February, Lena had crossed the English Channel to begin studying under Vaudeline. Lena knew she wasn't her teacher's most devoted student. She wavered in her beliefs often, struggling with the necessity of the devil's incantation or the Palo Santo or the bowl of warbler shells. It wasn't that she didn't believe, she simply couldn't be sure. None of this could be proven. None of this could be weighed or analyzed or turned over in her hands like the stones and specimens she kept back home. Where other students might have readily accepted even the most far-fetched theories about the occult, Lena found herself constantly asking how. How do you know for sure? And though she'd attended one seance several years ago, nothing convincing had come of it. Certainly, no ghosts had appeared. It was maddening, this truth versus illusion business. In her 23 years of life, Lena had never seen an apparition. Some claimed to feel a cool presence when walking among old estates and cemeteries, or said they'd seen a flicker in the candlelight or a human-like shadow on the wall. Lena would nod along, wanting badly to believe. But couldn't these be explained by something more reasonable? Tricks of the light existed everywhere, prisms and reflections easily explained by science. If Lena had been asked a few months ago to travel to Paris to participate in a seance, she might have laughed. and studying the art of seance itself. Quite the waste of time, what with so many rock specimens waiting to be collected along the River Thames. But then came All Hallows Eve, the night Lena found her precious younger sister, Evie, stabbed to death in the garden of their parents' modest travelers' hotel, the Hickway House, on Euston Road. It was clear there had been a struggle. Evie's hair was in disarray, and there was trauma, blanching and bruising, to various parts of her body. Her satchel, emptied of its contents, had been flung next to her body. In the days that followed, the police had given Evie's death as much attention as they gave the murder of any middle-class woman, which was to say not much at all. 3 months gone, and not a single answer. Lena was desperate, and desperation prevailed over disbelief. She knew that now. She adored Evie more than anything else in this world. Magic, witchcraft, poltergeists. She'd commit to any of it, if it meant finding a way to reconnect with her beloved younger sister. Besides, even though Lena hadn't made up her mind about ghosts, she considered that her treasured fossils might be proof that remnants of life could still exist after death. Evie had first posed the idea, and now more than ever Lena yearned to see the truth in it. Evie had been a budding medium, an unyielding believer in spirits, and a former student and devotee of Vaudeline. If anyone could find a way to breach the barrier between life and death, it would be her. Lena needed to communicate with her, to learn the truth about what had happened. The police might not have been willing to pursue justice, but Lena was. So she had chosen to set aside her doubts and learn, if not master, this strange art of seance. She could not even properly grieve, so consumed was she with untangling the crime against her sister. Lena didn't want to mourn, not yet. Before she mourned, she wanted vengeance. Knowing Vaudeline wouldn't travel to London, she hadn't been back, not since her abrupt departure the year before. Lena had decided to make the trip to Paris. She was determined to solve Evie's death, one way or another, even if it meant spending a month under the tutelage of a stranger, albeit a stranger she'd decided she quite liked, and even if it meant learning the sinister subtleties of an art in which she was not sure she believed. Besides, perhaps tonight that would change. Perhaps tonight she would see her first ghost. Lena pushed her hands between her thighs. She was trembling and did not want anyone to see it. She wanted to appear a brave understudy, an adept student, and she needed to demonstrate her level-headedness for the sake of the parents across the table, who were visibly terrified about what might unfold tonight. She was glad she'd met them a few days ago in a place far less ominous. They'd visited Vaudeline's sizable flat in central Paris, and the 4 of them had gathered in the parlor to talk through their questions about the upcoming séance. And the risks. Lena knew the risks of séance already. She and Vaudeline had discussed them when she first presented herself as a prospective student, but during the meeting in the parlor, the hazard seemed of greater consequence. "You will not find any Ouija boards or planchettes in my possession," Vaudeline had explained to the parents. "Those are the playthings of children and addicts. My séances are apt to take a different, more dangerous direction." The parlor door opened, and a guesthouse maid brought in tea for the 4 of them. She set it on the table in front of the group, next to a diagram Lena and Vaudeline had been studying earlier with the proper setting of a séance table with its many outils. The black beeswax candles, the opals and amethysts, the snakeskins and salt bowls. A trance state, the mother offered, once the maid had gone. Precisely. Having been under Vaudeline's tutelage for some weeks, Lena didn't need to ask for clarification. She knew that in mediumship, a trance state, or entrancement, occurred when a spirit quite literally took over the medium's flesh, once again subsisting within a living, breathing body. Vaudeline described it as a sort of dual existence which allowed mediums to cognize the memories and thoughts of the deceased while also maintaining their own, in parallel. The mother took a sip of her tea, then leaned forward to withdraw something from her bag, a newspaper clipping. Her hands trembled just as they had upon her arrival, when she'd stared at Vaudeline a long while before being able to speak. Lena had reacted the same upon first meeting Vaudeline, though it wasn't because she'd been dazzled by the medium's reputation. It had more to do with her cloud-colored eyes and the way she'd held Lena's gaze a few seconds longer than convention permitted. The brief moment had revealed plenty. Vaudeline was self-assured, and like Evie, she didn't care much for rules, both of which were traits that Lena found quite transfixing. The mother handed over the article. Lena couldn't understand the French headline, but the date of the article indicated it was a few years old. "It says a man died at one of your séances," the mother explained. "Is it true?" Vaudeline nodded. "Spirits are unpredictable," she said, "especially the ones we seek, the victims. The risk is greatest early in the séance, after I've recited the invocation, which invites all nearby spirits into the room. It is like turning on a water spigot. To manifest the spirit of a murder victim and solve a crime, I must also deal with the dead at the periphery. I try to get through this stage quickly, but I cannot keep them at bay entirely." She nodded to the article. "Did the police ever determine how the man died?" the mother asked. "Heart failure, officially. But those of us in the room saw it happen, the shadow of a hand over his mouth." Vaudeline handed the article back over. "In a decade of doing séances, only 3 people have died on my watch. It is very rare. More common is the sudden appearance of wounds, which are connected to the traumas suffered by the victim before their death. Lacerations, twisted ligaments, bruises." The father dropped his head forward, and Lena fought a sudden urge to leave the room. Maybe even vomit. Their daughter had been strangled. What if a rope burn spontaneously appeared on someone's neck during the seance? The mere thought of it was intolerable. There are lesser dangers, as well, Vaudeline continued. Perhaps she sensed it would be wise to move on. The things someone might engage in, for instance. At a seance a few months ago, 2 of the participants, under the influence of spirits, began to fornicate on the table. Lena gave a small gasp. For all the stories Vaudeline had shared with her in the last 2 weeks, she hadn't heard this one. Were they lovers beforehand? She asked, thinking surely the parents were as curious as her. Vaudeline shook her head. They'd never met in their lives. She turned, and Lena's gaze fell on the tiny freckle at the tip of Vaudeline's nose. So small it might be mistaken for a shadow. Despite the risks, Vaudeline said, looking back to the parents, trances are the quickest and most effective way to get the information needed to solve a case. This is not about entertainment or peace-seeking. If that's what you're after, I'd direct you to any number of reputable ghost hunters throughout the city. The father cleared his throat. I am concerned, he said, gently taking his wife's hand. Well, I am concerned about my wife's well-being if we hold the seance at the shadow, where our daughter died. Where our daughter died, he'd said. Easier words to say aloud than where our daughter was killed. That was too much to admit, too sharp on the tongue. Lena knew this better than anyone. Vaudeline looked at the wife. You will need to find a way to remain composed, or I suggest you do not attend at all. She sat back and folded her hands together, inviting no further discussion about it. This was, after all, one of Vaudeline's key beliefs. A spirit could only be conjured within proximity to the site of their death. If she could perform a séance from afar, Lena wouldn't be here in Paris at all. She'd have written Vaudeline and asked her to perform Evie's séance in France and then report back to Lena with the results. But as Vaudeline had publicly stated, she wouldn't be returning to London anytime soon. Lena would have to learn the art of séance herself in Paris, then return to the site of Evie's death with the hope of conjuring her sister's spirit on her own. Plenty of mediums carry out séances in their own homes, the mother said now. Nowhere near the place where their loved ones have died. And plenty of mediums are frauds. Vaudeline swirled her cup of tea and went on, undeterred. I understand it is difficult to be at the site of your daughter's death, but we are not there to be delicate with our emotions. We are there to solve a crime. This might have come across as cold, but Vaudeline had said it countless times. She could not intertwine herself with the grief of the family. Grief was weakness, and there was nothing so dangerous in the séance room as weakness of any kind. Spirits, the dangerous, free-roaming ones, apt to haunt and tease sitters whether summoned or not, liked weakness. It will be just the 2 of you, is that right? Vaudeline asked. The father gave a single nod. Was your daughter married, or did she have a beau? If so, it would be helpful to extend an invitation to him or her. The more of your daughter's latent energy we can gather in the room, the better. No, the father said. Not married, and no beau. That we're aware of, at least, the mother added, giving a small smile. Our daughter was quite independent. Lena smiled, musing on the woman's delicate word choice. Perhaps her daughter had been a bit like Evie, free-spirited, unbridled. The mother coughed lightly. Might I ask, she said, looking at Lena, what role you will play in the séance? She is not part of my traditional cohort, Vaudeline added, which typically has 3 to 5 students. Lena's circumstances were such that, after she arrived between cohorts a couple of weeks ago, I opted to take her on for an individualized training program. This was all factual, if not grossly short on detail. When Lena arrived in Paris and told Vaudeline that Evie, her former student, had been murdered in London, Vaudeline found the news staggering. She quickly ushered Lena in, set her up in the empty bunk room typically set aside for students, and began an accelerated training program. Typically, cohorts studied under Vaudeline for 8 weeks, but she aimed to have Lena's training done in half that time. I didn't realize you taught mediumship, the mother said to Vaudeline, in addition to conducting séances yourself. Yes, I've been a medium for 10 years, a teacher for 5. She leaned forward, her tone more serious now. Regarding the séance, there are things you can do to diminish the risks I've just laid out. Foremost, no wine or liquor beforehand. Not even a drop. And do your best to keep any tears at bay. Don't dwell on memories. Memories are weakness. And in the séance room, weakness is your downfall. The peril posed by weakness was one of the first lessons Vaudeline had taught Lena when their studies began. The world teemed with ghosts. Every bedchamber, every meadow, every seaport. Over millennia, so long as people had lived, so too had they died, and they did not go far. Because of this, Vaudeline explained, many séances resulted in the appearance of spirits that weren't invited. Most of these were benign and merely curious. They longed to feel the sensation of embodiment once again, or they meant to playfully tease the sitters. Vaudeline had no problem steering these affable spooks away. It was the malicious spirits and destructive poltergeists that posed the danger, and much could go wrong during a séance on their account. They might entrance Vaudeline before the target spirit had a chance to do so, or they might entrance the sitters, a phenomenon known as absorptus. These entities were intelligent and knew exactly who to prey on, the crying, the young, the inebriated, the lustful. These were all forms of fragility, a sort of porousness allowing the diabolical being inside. To prevent such fiends from interrupting a séance, Vaudeline carefully assessed the sitters before the affair began. She did not permit anyone under the age of 16 to attend, nor anyone with liquor on their breath. Crying family members were sometimes tossed out. This diligence, together with the ancient, protective incantation that Vaudeline read at the start of each affair, and the 2 expulsive injunctions that could be used as a last resort, kept her seances safe. Most of the time, nothing was guaranteed. This was an art, Vaudeline said time and time again, and spirits were terribly unpredictable. At the shadow, Lena glanced up from her notebook and looked again at the parents, studying their expressions. The father's face was hard, both hands set firmly on the table. He looked ready for battle. The mother, meanwhile, had a gray, dazed look in her eyes, and a streak of dried tears had carved a rivulet through the rouge on her cheeks. Lena was proud of her, proud of both of them, but their strength might put her in a vulnerable position. She shuddered, wondering whether a spirit might find her the weakest person in the room, or if something else might go awry. She recalled a few of Vaudeline's stories, tales of people pulling weapons on one another while in a trance state, or candelabras thrust across the room as if by their own accord. Lena glanced around now, thankful there were no candelabras to be seen. Vaudeline unlocked a leather suitcase and pulled a few items out. Everyone else had taken their places, and a nervous silence descended upon the room. What, Lena wondered, would transpire in the minutes to come? She chewed mindlessly at her fingernails, a lifelong vice, and watched Vaudeline closely for any signs of trickery. She could find none. Vaudeline retrieved 2 lengths of black linen from her case. She delicately hung them over the brick hearth and the lead-latticed window at the front of the room, which overlooked the entrance to the dilapidated shadow. The bottom portion of the window glass was broken, so the fabric would keep out the drafts. But Lena knew the other reason Vaudeline covered it now, for they had reviewed it in their studies. Windows were portals of light and encouraged the entrance and movement of uninvited spirits who had died close by. Hearths, too. A rogue spirit could swoop down a chimney as easily as it could come through a window. Thus, it was best to encapsulate the room if possible. Close and dark. Well, things certainly felt close now. Vaudeline finally took a seat, pulling her chair closer to Lena and angling her legs toward her. Lena wondered if the movement was inadvertent. She hoped not. As Vaudeline opened her book of incantations, her long lashes cast shadows on her cheeks. A wisp of hair slipped loose and dangled in front of her face, but she paid it no mind as she turned the pages of her book, the fabric of her silk gown sliding easily over her pale arms. Lena caught the father gazing at Vaudeline. His pupils had gone wide and black, and his lips were parted. Lena recognized this look, lust, and she didn't blame him a bit. One might call the man deviant, even debased, for having the capacity to feel desire while still so overwhelmed by grief and loss. But not Lena. She knew this twist and tangle well. Indeed, they might have made an ugly pair, grief and desire. But Lena couldn't blame the man across the table, for she suffered both agonies herself these days. The room grew very still. The candle did not flicker, nor did the window covering rustle. The séance had not yet begun, but it was undeniable. Vaudeline had established full and complete control of the room. Anything she asked, the participants would do. Lena was glad for it, comforted by Vaudeline's steady expertise, so in contrast with the eerie feeling about the room. She recalled her teacher's promise en route to the shadow. No harm will befall you, Vaudeline had said softly. You would be the first I would protect, if needed. Ma promisitoi. Now, Lena repeated these words, this promise, in her mind. Her own incantation. Vaudeline withdrew a small watch from inside her cloak. She studied its face, then returned it to an inner pocket. We will begin in 40 seconds, she said. Across the table, the mother of the victim sniffled, and the father cleared his throat, straightened his back. Lena could not fathom the emotion plaguing them, the nuanced temptation and terror of what they were about to experience. What must it feel like to approach an encounter with one's dead daughter? The same, probably, as it felt to approach an encounter with one's dead sister. The thought jarred Lena. Tonight, and indeed her entire course of study, were not just about learning the art of séance. This endeavor, ultimately, was about communicating with Evie and learning the truth about her murder. Lena offered a warm smile to the mother across the table. Candlelight glinted in the woman's eyes. She was fighting back tears. Lena wished she could whisper a few words of comfort to her, but the time for that had long passed. The sitters kept their eyes low as the 40 seconds ticked slowly by. Lena could hear the timepiece inside Vaudeline's cloak, the movement of the tiny mechanism within its metal encasement. She knew Vaudeline was counting the ticks. Then she would begin her first incantation, the protective exordium, the prelude, extracted from a 1,000-year-old Latin text on demons. Lena had already memorized the first 4 stanzas, but there were 12 in total. She waited for Vaudeline's long intake of air. The incantation needed to be recited in a single, unbroken breath. Breath control was another thing Lena needed to practice. While reading the incantation from her notebook in recent days, she could only get through half of it before feeling faint and gasping for air. The candle closest to the hearth flickered, and somewhere nearby, was it outside the room, or above it? A thump sounded. Lena froze, looked up from her notebook. It had not been mice in the floorboards, that much was clear. The pencil fell from her fingers. Instinctively, she leaned closer to Vaudeline, ready to clasp her hand if it came to that. Decorum be damned. Something is coming, Vaudeline said suddenly. Her voice remained even and low. She kept her gaze down, eyes closed. The thump sounded again. Lena tensed, jerking her head toward the family. Across the table, the mother's eyes were wide, and the father leaned forward, looking hopeful. Surely, they thought this thumping meant the spirit of their daughter was nearly upon them. But Vaudeline hadn't covered the detailed 7-stage sequence with them, so they couldn't know that it was too soon for a manifestation, that the seance had not even begun. Lena might have been the only one of them to know it, but something was not right. The sequence was off. Vaudeline would never begin a seance without the devil's incantation meant to protect them all. For a moment, terror seized her. Was there some demon making its way into the room at this very moment? Something sinister enough to have disrupted Vaudeline's sequence. A chill ran down her arms as she waited for the medium to act. Still, Vaudeline had not moved. Bravely, as a sort of second in command, Lena turned to her. "Something is coming. A spirit," she whispered. Vaudeline exhaled, frustration writ on her face. She shook her head and held up a finger as though to say, "Just wait." At once, the door to the room flew open. Several days earlier, across the English Channel, in London. Chapter 2. Mr. Morley. London, Monday, the 10th of February 1873. On the second story of the London Séance Society, a West End gentleman's only establishment, I sat hunched over a mahogany desk in my private study. In front of me a lantern flickered, its blue-orange glow illuminating the items scattered about my desk. A few blank sheets of society stationery, a monocle on a silver chain, an inkwell in the shape of a bell. I spent a few moments massaging the swollen half-moons beneath my eyes, evidence of strain and worry. I had not slept well for several months, and my jaw was in a constant state of clench. We were facing a few problems here at the Society. Not in the department of clairvoyance, no, that unit was clean as a whistle. Rather, the problems lay within the department of spiritualism, where I'd served as vice president since joining the Society a decade ago. Like any good gentleman of authority, I knew all there was to know about my department. I knew which seances we'd done last week. Indeed, I was the one who made member assignments, and I knew the location of every reference guide in our library, every volume on the occult. I knew the department's revenue numbers, the names of members' wives, and what we would serve for breakfast at the department assembly 3 days hence. No matter how personal or trivial the information might be, I knew it all. So when it came to the mess we were facing at the Department of Spiritualism, the responsibility to clean things up fell on me, and me alone. An empty brandy glass sat at my right, my lips still stung with the last unsatisfying sip of it. I poured myself another, gazing straight ahead at a small frame affixed to the wall. Inside the frame was the Society's mission. Established in 1860, the mission of the London Séance Society is to provide clairvoyance and mediumship services throughout the city of London, with the intent of providing peace to mourners, and satisfying the populace's growing curiosity about the afterlife. I crossed my arms, dwelling on this. Providing peace and satisfying curiosity were indeed what we excelled at. More than 200 members belonged to the Society. Roughly 2/3 of them were members of the Department of Clairvoyance, led by their vice president, my counterpart, Mr. T. Shaw. Shaw's department performed hundreds of readings across London every month. Its reputation was impeccable and its revenue consistent. Shaw's vetting process had something to do with it. Before admission to the Society, prospective members of his department were required to demonstrate their skills in clairaudience, numerology, divination, or whatever other talent they possessed. Things were done somewhat differently in my area, the Department of Spiritualism. For one, we did less business. We performed only a dozen or so seances each month. Further, members in our department were invite-only, and my vetting process was less precise. Unlike Shaw's clairvoyance, who could identify the date on a coin in my pocket, I could not rightfully expect my prospective members to conjure a ghost on command in a boardroom. This meant that membership in my department was determined based on trusted references, the old who knows who. But have no doubt about it, my vetting process might have been less rigorous, but I was no less picky. My standards were high. Both Shaw and I reported up to the president, Mr. Volkman. Volkman had founded the Society 12 years ago, just as the notion of ghosts began to take hold of the city. Seances, spirits, spooks, they were all en vogue, and London could not get enough. Seeing a financial opportunity, Volkman got to work, bringing Shaw and me in early. He'd been an admirable leader. Before his death, that is. On the corner of my desk was yet another article about that unfortunate night, published in this morning's paper. I glanced at the headline, "Still no answers for London gentleman murdered during evening soiree," and read the brief report in its entirety again. The Metropolitan Police Service continues to investigate the circumstances surrounding the murder of Mr. M. Volkman, Mayfair resident, which occurred more than 3 months ago. Volkman was an esteemed gentleman, father, husband, and president of the renowned West End Gentlemen's Club, the London Séance Society. Volkman's body, badly mauled, was discovered on the 31st of October in a private cellar near Grosvenor Square, managed by a Mr. M. Morley of London, vice president of the Society's Department of Spiritualism. An All Hallows Eve soiree had taken place at the cellar that evening. Volkman's body was found in the cellar's subbasement by Mr. Morley himself. At least 100 partygoers attended the event held on the premises that evening, a fact which the Met reports is a significant complication in their investigation. Mr. Volkman was an upstanding family man. His friends insist he'd accrued no gambling debts and had never antagonized anyone. An exemplary gentleman, his loved ones report, leaving us still to speculate who might have wanted him dead. I set the article down, agitated, and stood from my well-worn leather chair. I began to pace the small room and approached a mirror affixed to the wall next to the society mission document. I took a long look and frowned, as I always did, at the reflection that met my eyes. 36 years old with a handsome head of hair, no thinning, no receding, and a sharp jaw, a straight nose. But my complexion, I despised it. A birthmark, deep red in color and mottled, stretched its way from below my left eye and across my face to my ear. This wasn't a small blemish, easily covered with a spot of rouge. It was the width of my palm, and while once it had been smooth, over time this area of skin had thickened. It now took on a raised, rough appearance. During childhood, the feature had endeared me to adults. It would disappear someday, everyone assured me. But it hadn't, and how shamed it left me now. None of my friends were plagued with such a flaw. Among London's finest gentlemen, I stood out, and not in a good way. If only the blemish could be scrubbed away or bleached. As an adolescent, I'd rubbed it raw with sand and lime. When that gave me nothing but splotchy lesions on the entire left side of my face, I made a homemade concoction, vinegar, mixed with a brightening cream I found among my mother's things and applied that to my skin overnight. Week after week, I tried such absurd tactics. Not a single one of them worked. If anything, I think the birthmark grew darker, maybe even larger. The worst part of it, the way women now looked upon me for a second too long, as though I were a strange, foreign specimen. Having such a blemish didn't bode well for my marriage prospects, either. Not only did it prove a hindrance in attracting women, but no one could explain what exactly had caused the imperfection. My parents hadn't had enormous birthmarks on their faces. What woman would risk such a thing afflicting her children, too? Now I ran my hand along my cheek. My facial hair hid a small portion of the birthmark, but I considered the rest a pathetic visage upon which to gaze. I turned away. Shame at my appearance was something with which I had eventually made peace, but still I hated mirrors. Mr. Volkman had always looked past my appearance. In all the years I knew him, he had not so much as remarked on it. I missed him dearly. Despite being a decade my senior and a man of extraordinary demands, he had been a mentor, a confidant, a partner. He'd been a generous man, too, the very reason my mother and I hadn't floundered financially a decade ago after my father, a successful textile merchant, had died from pneumonia. The two of us tried mightily to keep my father's fabric shop afloat, but neither of us had the talent or the showmanship for sales. In a matter of months, a veneer of dust settled over our inventory. The silk panels precut for drapery, the lengths of wool for winter gowns, the bright pink cottons meant for livery attire. All of it went out of style, as we hadn't the funds to purchase the latest patterns or refresh our product. Our upper-class clientele wasted no time closing their credit accounts and taking their business elsewhere. Mr. Volkman, a longtime patron of the shop, took pity on us. I wondered if he felt sorry for me, a 26-year-old gentleman with class and manners, yet unmarried, burdened by a failing business and an aging mother. Mr. Volkman had just founded the London Séance Society, and was in search of someone reliable, someone loyal, to establish and lead the department of spiritualism. He took me under his wing and paid me a handsome salary, enough to provide for my mother. She closed the textile shop, selling off what little she could, while I buried my face in countless texts about spiritualism, the nature of souls, the ways in which spirits relay information, the tools to facilitate these communications. He gave me plenty of rein to run the department as I liked. As revenues began to accrue, I could tell he was pleased, and maybe even somewhat surprised. I would be forever indebted to Mr. Volkman. His generosity had not only saved my family from financial ruin, but it had renewed my social standing and provided me with a circle of posh friends. I wanted to do right by him. Volkman had been a man of high expectations and low tolerance for error, and of particular concern was the society's reputation for credibility, authenticity. He gave no grace when these were threatened. He was none too happy, then, when a groundswell of rumors began in early 1872, mostly parlor-room whispers that the society laced their seances with ruses and magic tricks. The information was brought to him by one of his close associates, someone who knew the occult circles in London quite well. These rumors, specific to my department, reflected badly on the entire organization. It implied that the whole of the society's work consisted of hoaxes and ploys and that we were nothing but illusionists. Men of theater magic. Never mind the goodwill between us, Mr. Volkman was irate, especially with me. It was my department causing problems, after all, and I couldn't disagree with him. The thought of the society's impeccable reputation, marred by rumors of such misconduct, made me sick. Beneath the mirror was yet another frame, this one containing newspaper clippings, all of them written by satisfied customers. I am utterly delighted with the outcome of the séance held a fortnight ago. One of them read, "The gentlemen of the London Séance Society manifested my dead husband, and when they asked his ghost if I should be set free to love again, a wild hammering came from inside the chimney." I remembered that séance well, the look of delight on the widow's face, the look of relief. It was better than the money. Not that the money wasn't also quite good. The Society's honorable reputation over the last decade meant plenty of commissioned work for the organization, and at the end of each quarter, profits were aggregated and distributed via a dividend to Society members. For many, these dividends were the most attractive benefit of membership. It encouraged them to hone their skills in clairsentience or spirit channeling, so better to keep business flowing. For others, it wasn't about the money so much as the gentleman's camaraderie. The Society headquarters was a place to escape the monotony of home life and partake in stimulating conversation, exclusive parties, extravagant meals. And for a remaining few, the most appealing benefit to membership was neither the income nor the exclusivity. It was the women with whom we tended to work. The nature of our services meant unhindered access to many homes throughout the city. The Society was quite discerning, and especially in my department it was no coincidence that nearly all of our clients were wealthy widows and left-behind heiresses. I monitored the obituaries, and I knew well the aristocratic bloodlines, the surnames associated with landholdings or politics, in other words, the sort of women not apt to balk at expensive seances. Though we worked with them often, women were not allowed at the Society headquarters, and they never had been, not since the Society's founding. During the last leadership meeting Volkman attended, in late October, one member had made a motion to strike the rule. Shouldn't women be permitted as special dinner guests, at least? Despite being a family man himself, Volkman had laughed at the notion. Gentlemen retreat to the Society to escape their wives, he'd said, not to consort further with them. We wouldn't invite our wives to Morley's cellar parties in Grosvenor Square, would we? We'd all laughed at this. For several years, I'd thrown large parties in the underground space, which was large enough to host 100 guests. I'd been managing the cellar for years as a way to earn extra income. It held nearly 200 casks, gin, vermouth, blended whiskey, and an ample amount of wine. My responsibility was to turn the barrels, transport them in and out, shoo the rats away. The barrels and bottles themselves were owned by a distributor in North London. None of our members told their wives about my cellar parties. We were good secret keepers, all of us, and especially Volkman. He was immensely loyal to the things he valued. For a decade, we'd done just fine at the Society, going about things the way we did. Until those rumors began. On the heels of the gossip, business started to decline. In my department, commissions sank 14% quarter over quarter. Shaw's wasn't far behind. The declining revenue was alarming enough, but the reduced dividends were most problematic. A few of the members, dissatisfied with their distributions, threatened to leave. The citywide chatter was dangerous, but members abandoning ship. These defectors would do us no favors. People would start asking questions, more than they already had. No, I could not let it happen. I could not let the Society implode. The merrymaking, the money, all of it was too good. Volkman demanded I get to the bottom of things. We needed to identify the problem and resolve it as quickly as possible. He, too, promised to do some digging. Only, his efforts had eventually gotten him killed. Somewhere outside, beyond the windowless walls of the room, a warbler began to sing its cheerful tune. The bird had taken up this evening song in recent days. Strange behavior for an animal that normally sang a morning chorus, but so it went with wild things. I glanced once more at the article about Volkman's death, tapping my finger on the final sentence, who might have wanted him dead. The warbler sang louder. I spared a few moments listening to the tiny vocalist. Envying its glee, then I hung my head and pinched the bridge of my nose. It would be perilous, this task ahead of me. Chapter 3 Lena, Paris, Thursday, the 13th of February 1873. At the Shadow, the door of the old parlor swung open. The mother of the murdered woman let out a horrified scream. Lena turned to look, and she could make out the dark shadows of something human-like in the doorway. If this is a ghost, she thought, then I have been so terribly wrong about everything. The shadow stepped forward into the parlor. More clearly in view now, Lena noticed the dark uniform, the stubble on his chin. It was the very corporeal form of a young man, lantern swinging in his hand. 4 brass buttons on his coat caught the glimmer of candlelight, and slung across his chest was a leather messenger's bag. He stood there panting, his cheeks flushed with cold. A few snowflakes stuck to his coat, melting as he stepped into the room. "Who is this?" the father muttered, his voice low and heavy with confusion. He glanced at his wife, an incredulous look on his face. She remained silent. The father's ferocity, paired with the mother's meekness, reminded Lena very much of her own parents. After Evie's death several months ago, their mother had left for the countryside with a cousin. She'd tried to endure the city for a couple of weeks, taking callers in the parlor of the Hickway house, a crepe veil draped over her glassy eyes. But with her daughter's death unsolved, everyone took on an air of suspicion. Whether strangers or old friends, Lena's mother trusted no one. This left Lena's father to oversee the hotel. It was manageable, only 24 beds, mostly travelers stopping over from King's Cross and St. Pancras stations, but even still, Lena knew the strain on her father was great, and she looked forward to the day when her mother felt well enough to return to the city. Now the grieving father across the table shifted in his seat. "Is this man real?" he asked aloud. Lena wondered the same. For all she and Vaudeline had covered in the last 2 weeks, she had not asked the most fundamental of questions. What, exactly, did a ghost look like? She wondered if ghosts were supposed to resemble the floating, ethereal forms depicted in children's books, or if they were as tangible and lifelike as the man standing now in the doorway. Quickly, she looked down at her notebook, where she'd made diligent notes in recent days. She flitted her eyes over the page, looking for some clue that she might have missed. The way he pants, Lena thought, and the flush on his face. He seems entirely real, but how can I know for sure? Evie wouldn't have worried herself with such questions. Her beliefs had always come effortlessly, not plagued by misgivings, by science, by reason. Lena, in contrast, liked to think of herself as a girl of logic and practicality. She'd always been interested in the natural world, but never more so than when she met Stephen Heslop. Stephen was the twin brother of Alois, who had been a close friend of Evie and Lena's. Stephen was only a few months older than Lena, and the two of them became acquainted when he returned from his studies at Oxford to work in the Museum of Practical Geology on Jermyn Street studying minerals and fossils. Stephen regularly came to the Hickway house to call on Lena, and he often brought work with him, like chisels and brushes needing repair. Lena would sit with him while he tended to his tools in the garden, and her interest in naturalism grew as Stephen explained to her the science of fossils. She even accompanied him to the museum a few times, familiarizing herself with the wide range of stone collections. One day, Stephen brought her a small round stone, but it was not like any Lena had seen before. It was translucent, the color of whiskey, and called amber. By giving her the gift, Lena knew that Stephen was trying to spark a courtship. But although she liked spending time with him, she was unmoved by his romantic interest. What most excited her was the resin stone itself and that which lay within, the skeleton of a tiny arachnid, no larger than a fingernail, and the nearly invisible strands of her web, still spun in perfect formation. It was a young stone, Stephen told her, less than 100,000 years old. "It's yours," he said, a glimmer of sweat on his upper lip. He reached his hand forward to touch Lena's arm, but she gently leaned out of his reach, studying more closely the tiny hairs on the spider's crooked arms. So began her collection of ancient amber specimens and a desire to know more of things like this, relics made of minerals, or fossilized spiders discovered in far-off places by explorers who braved to leave this city of fog and damp. A few weeks later, Stephen returned from the museum with waste materials from the laboratory, including a bag of half-dried clay and a few broken tools. He let Lena experiment with making some fossil casts herself, and she went out to gather a dead perch from the Thames. With its spiny dorsal fin, it left a nice imprint for Lena. It was something she could touch with the pad of her finger, which appealed to her. She was fascinated by anything physical, viewable, provable. Just like the little spider in her amber-soaked web. It did not change, did not vanish, unlike the subjects with which Evie occupied herself. Evie had always preferred subjects ethereal in nature, apparitions, premonitions, dreams. She dutifully did her work at their parents' hotel each day, then she delved into her vague, strange studies at night. She believed ghosts existed everywhere, beneath some layer of life as yet invisible to her. With the right formula, the right spell, or the right amulet, she believed this realm might be unveiled. She believed she might make a good profit from it, too. In London, ghosts had come into fashion only a few years earlier. Evie spotted the opportunity. Her personal obsession could make her good money. She believed she could get rich off this, very rich, if only she could obtain the necessary training. Thus, a couple of years ago in London, she'd been thrilled to secure a place in one of Vaudeline Dallaire's cohorts. Vaudeline was a worthy name to drop in smoky, shrouded parlors, and Evie knew the experience would give her a leg up. It wasn't greedy, Lena had to admit. It was brilliant. More than the sisters' interests differed. They lacked any physical resemblance, as well. Evie had short black hair and watery blue eyes, just like their mother, but Lena had inherited their father's butter-colored waves and hazel eyes. Further, while Lena was quite feminine, Evie had always been a bit rugged and boyish, unadorned, if not downright plain. In looks, anyway, certainly not in demeanor. She was as smart and spunky as anyone Lena had ever met. Too smart, if Lena was honest with herself. Cunning, even. Like all sisters, the girls quarreled often. The week before Evie's death, they'd been sitting alone in their shared room at the hotel. While Evie read a book, Lena studied her fossil casts. She just held the perch cast up to the oil lamp, observing the intricate dips and hollows made by the flesh of the fish. "You have just proved that I am right," Evie said. She looked up from her papers, light glinting off her pink cheeks. "Sorry, your little perch cast that you cannot stop staring at. The fish is dead and gone. Yet the form of him is right in front of you, just as it will be in that clay for all of time. It's the same of ghosts. We may die, but we are never really gone." Lena traced her thumbnail along the round belly of the imprint. She hadn't thought of it this way, but still, she wouldn't cede so easily to her younger sister. "Isn't that full of ideals?" Evie huffed. "Something cannot be an illusion if it still exists after we think it has gone. Including the fossils and stones you obsess over. Last week, you went on about a leaf fossil your beau had brought from the museum. It was, 1,000 years old. 4,000. And he's not my beau, right?" Evie crossed her hands in her lap. "Well, the leaf itself is long gone. Decayed. But it left its mark, did it not? There is still something of it left behind. Or are you to say the leaf itself was an illusion because it exists no more?" Evie had a point. Even Lena's amber stone with the spider inside was evidence supporting the argument. The spider was perfectly preserved, dead, and yet not disappeared. Still, Lena would not surrender to Evie. She'd rather stay silent than admit she might be wrong. "You have spent too much time with Stephen, worrying about things that can be touched," Evie continued. You ought to join me on a ghost hunt someday. You might be surprised. You haven't spotted a single ghost. They are there, I assure you. She curled a leg up beneath her and lifted her book again. As much as your perch was once in that clay. Evie absent-mindedly toyed with a lace on her shoe, returning her gaze to the reading material spread out around her. A manual on table wrapping, whatever that was, and another on identifying the nature of orbs in photographs. There were ads for what appeared to be vials of phosphorus oil, a diagram on seance cabinet construction, and a booklet titled Catalog of Apportations. What are apportations? Lena asked. She'd never heard the word. Evie's eyes lit up. Oh, they're so fascinating. Apportations are little tokens that appear during seances, or any place where ghosts might be present. Coins, seashells, flowers, and the like. They just appear from the sky. Evie shrugged. Sometimes. Or you might look away and turn back and find the token right in front of you. She reached for the catalog and turned it to a dog-eared page near the center. These apportations are for sale at a fortune-telling shop on German Street. I visit often. I want this one. She held up the page to show an illustration of a feather. It's from a black-capped warbler. They're terribly noisy. You and your birds, Lena said, smiling. Evie had loved birds since she was little. It suited her well, given her wild, independent streak. It's the only feather apportation at the shop, Evie said. She turned to another page. Dozens of seashells, though. Lena went back to her fossil cast, musing on the likelihood that a token might actually fall from the sky. She couldn't get behind the idea shells and feathers didn't spontaneously appear. These were the sort of fantastical topics that marred spiritualism for Lena, making it hard to believe in any of it. Huh? Evie said suddenly, shaking her head. She'd returned to her newspaper. What is it? Evie nodded to the paper in her hands. A mechanism for applying false images of spirits onto photographs. She read on, brow furrowed in concentration. They've charged a man named Mr. Hudson at a photography studio in Holloway for double exposing negative plates. She turned the page. Studio was closed down just last month. Serves him right. Evie chewed her bottom lip. She looked as though she might reply, might even defend the man. But then she lifted the pen and the black notebook next to her, fervently making notes that Lena could not see. This minor squabble about fossils and ghosts was not the last quarrel between the girls. They'd argued the morning of Evie's death, in fact. It had been the worst row the two of them had ever had. 3 months might have passed since Evie's murder, but their argument that morning was too painful to think about, even now. Inside the shadow parlor, the newcomer in the uniform reached into his messenger bag. He withdrew an envelope, his hands trembling. Lena did not know what to make of him, did not know whether he was of this world or of Evie's. "Une letter urgent de Londres," the messenger said, his eyes wide. He thrust forward a small envelope. Faintly, in the low light, Lena could make out a hasty scrawl on the front and a blood-red stamp at the corner. It isn't a ghost, she decided, not unless a ghost could intercept the postal service and lay hands on an envelope as real as this one. Still, the post didn't show up at Abandoned Shadows at midnight. Clearly, this was not just any messenger. He must have gone to the guest house in Paris, asked of Vaudeline's whereabouts, and then, given the sweat on his brow, pushed his horse hard to get here. Now Lena was less concerned with who the messenger was and more curious about who had sent him. The letter, whatever it contained, must have been of utmost importance. Slowly, Vaudeline outstretched her hand, but she startled at a sudden commotion on the other side of the table. "What is this?" the father cried out, looking at Vaudeline. He stood with such force that his chair tipped over, its clatter echoing about the room. "Is this a prank?" he asked her. His words seeped with hostility, but beneath them, Lena saw the statement for what it really was. This was grief. Ugly, unresolved, complicated grief, like the kind Lena suffered herself. This was a man who feared he would never see his daughter again, and he'd lost her in the worst possible way. He pointed a plump finger at the messenger. "How much did she pay you to interrupt? Tell me now, boy." Lena threw the father a glance, her eyes wide. It was a brave accusation, but then again, the timing was uncanny. The young man had arrived just seconds before the protective incantation. Coincidence, or no such thing. She turned to look at Vaudeline, who had recovered herself and now waved the messenger over. She took the envelope from him, muttered a word of thanks, and slipped the letter out. No sooner had she unfolded the paper than Lena spotted it, the thick black border around the edge. The letter, then, was an announcement. Someone had died. But who? My God, Vaudeline whispered as she read. A look of horror crossed her face. "What is it?" Lena asked, pretending she had not seen the ribbon of black framing the words. On the other side of the table, the father remained standing, the knocked-over chair at his side. Vaudeline folded the letter up, placed it back in the envelope, and tucked the envelope into her cloak. Her face was grim. Was it grief or fright? She locked her gaze on Lena. "Let's finish this quickly," she said. She turned to the father. "Please, take your seat." As the parents settled back in, Vaudeline fussed with a few of the outils on the table. She reached first for a jar of crushed warbler eggshells. The shells were apt to make spirits more communicative during a seance, or so Vaudeline claimed, but she knocked the jar over, spilling the shells onto the table. Lena bent forward to help her pick up the mottled pieces. Meanwhile, the messenger left quickly with a look of relief on his face. A few moments later, Lena spotted him outside, through the window, mounting his black pony. The snow outside had stopped, and the atmosphere in the parlor felt more sober even than a few minutes ago. At last, Vaudeline began the first stage of the seance, the ancient devil's incantation. It went smoothly, without complication, but just as she was to recite the second incantation, the invocation, she paused, stifling a quiet sob. "I'm very sorry," she said to the room. "I just need a moment." Lena reached over, gave her hand a quick squeeze. Vaudeline had warned the parents to keep their tears at bay, yet here she was, fighting them herself. Vaudeline knew well the risks of seance and the importance of remaining stoic, so Lena could only imagine how intrusive Vaudeline's emotions must be now. The black-bordered letter must have brought very bad news, indeed. Suddenly, Lena wished this seance over and done with. She reminded herself that this night was about justice and peace for the parents sitting across the table. But if she were honest with herself, she longed to know who'd sent the letter and what news it had divulged. "Can I help?" Lena whispered to Vaudeline. She hadn't memorized the incantations, but she had them written in her notebook and could easily read them aloud if need be. Vaudeline gave her an appreciative look. "Yes, actually." She dabbed her eyes again. "Go ahead with the invocation." Lena hadn't actually thought Vaudeline would agree, and she now flipped through the pages of her notebook with a trembling hand. They'd only practiced this a few times. Vaudeline had always been complimentary of the way Lena articulated the challenging Latin words and the rhythm with which she recited the verses. Still, Lena had never performed a real incantation. In such an ominous setting, no less. Her fingers began to tingle, a pins and needles feeling underneath her nails, and a burst of sapphire light flashed several times in her peripheral vision. Nerves, surely, but she forged on. The sooner this was over, the sooner she could ask about the letter. She located the invocation and began to read.